It seems that the fates were determined to humble American pride. Shortly after 7 a.m., the sun, rising over the Tantalus Mountains, cast its first rays on Pearl Harbor, heightening the green of the cane fields that stretch up the slopes above Aia, and deepening the blue of the locks, as the arms of this harbor are called. Even for Oahu, favored by nature, this was an uncommonly bright and peaceful Sabbath morning. On board ships, the forenoon watch was piped to breakfast, while the men it would relieve at 8 a.m. concluded their various duties, such as cleaning brass and wiping dew off the machine guns and the 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Of these, only about 1 in 4 was fully manned. The main batteries were not manned, nor were the plotting rooms, directors, and ammunition supply. Ready ammunition was in locked boxes whose keys were in the hands of the officer of the deck. All ships had at least one boiler lighted, but few had enough steam up to get underway in a hurry. Among the 70 combatant ships and 24 auxiliaries in the harbour, only one, a destroyer, was underway. At about 7:40 a.m., the first Japanese attack wave, 40 torpedo bombers, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers and 51 fighters, sighted the Oahu coastline. They then deployed, the fighters to destroy parked planes at Wheeler Field and Kaneohe, the high-level bombers for Hickam Field, the torpedo planes and dive bombers for Battleship Row. By 7:50 a.m. they were ready to strike, and Captain Fuchida, the strike commander, gave their word. The sound of church bells at Honolulu, ringing for 8 o'clock mass, came over the harbour, whose calm surface was only lightly rippled by the breeze. Many officers were at breakfast, others were just rising. Seamen were lounging on deck, talking, reading, or writing letters home. As the hour for morning colours approached, sailors in white uniforms removed the jack and ensign from their lockers. A blue jacket on the signal bridge hoisted the blue peter, and boatswains were set to pipe the preparatory signal at 7:55 a.m. A few seconds before or after that hour, nobody could remember which, the air suddenly seemed filled with strange planes, hovering, darting, diving. A brisk dive bomber got in the first lick, on Ford Island Naval Air Headquarters, where Commander Ramsey, the operations officer who had been discussing the midget submarine sinkings over the telephone, thought it was accidental, from an overzealous army plane. Hardly anyone, for seconds or even minutes, even after seeing the red meatball on the fuselages, recognized the planes as Japanese. Some thought they were United States Army planes camouflaged as Japanese to give the Navy a scare. Others assumed that this was an air drill and thought it too realistic. Across the harbour, Rear Admiral William R. Furlong, in Minelayer Oglala, who had studied Japanese plane types, recognized the torpedo bombers when they zoomed up the main channel between him and Ford Island, and as he happened to be senior officer present afloat, he ordered the signal hoisted, all ships in harbour sortie. Almost simultaneously, someone in the signal tower ashore made the same observation and telephoned to Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters, enemy air raid, not drill. The Navy air arm on Ford Island took a little longer to realize the truth, so it was not until 7:58 a.m. that Admiral Bellinger broadcast a message which shook the United States as nothing had since the firing on Fort Sumter. Air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is no drill. Now, to quote John Milton, all hell broke loose. The Sabbath calm was shattered by bomb explosions, internal explosions and machine gun fire, with the hoarse signal of general quarters as obligato. At least 2 battleships were already doomed, and hundreds of American seamen dead by 7:58 a.m. Let us now concentrate on the first phase of the attack, from 7:55 a.m. to 8:25 a.m., during which about % of the damage was done. Battleship Row was located along the southeast shore of Ford Island, a few hundred yards across the main channel from the Navy Yard. The battle wagons were moored, some singly and others in pairs, to massive quays a short distance off the island shore. Nevada occupied the northeasterly berth, with an ammunition lighter outboard. Next came Arizona, with tender Vestal outboard. Southwest of them were Tennessee and West Virginia side by side, and the next pair was Maryland and Oklahoma. California alone had the southernmost berth. Pennsylvania was in dry dock across the harbour, where 5 cruisers were also berthed. 26 destroyers and minecraft were moored in groups in various parts of the harbour. The Japanese aviators knew exactly where to find the battleships, completely unprotected from torpedo attack, and made first for Arizona and the two pairs. The major attack was made by 12 Kate torpedo bombers, launching torpedoes from low altitudes, 40 to 100 feet above the water. 4 more Kates followed, almost simultaneously. Val dive bombers began combing Battleship Row fore and aft, dropping not only conventional bombs but converted 16-inch armor-piercing shells which penetrated the decks and exploded below. Then 5 more planes attacked Cruiser Raleigh, and 3 other ships moored on the northwest side of Ford Island. Most of these planes, after they had dropped bombs or torpedoes, flew back over their targets, strafing viciously in order to kill as many sailors as possible. Imagine the consternation that this sudden onslaught created among the officers and men on board. A surprise attack in war is bad enough to cope with, but this was a surprise attack in time of peace when, so far as anyone in Hawaii knew, diplomatic negotiations at Washington were continuing. What made defense even more difficult was the absence on weekend leave of many senior officers and chief petty officers to whom juniors were accustomed to look for orders and guidance. Yet the junior officers' and bluejackets' reaction, against fearful odds, was superb. Between explosions, one could hear sailors knocking off the padlocks from ready ammunition chests with axes and mauls. Dive bombers swooped so near that sailors could see the Japanese pilots' toothy grins, and in exasperation hurled monkey wrenches at them. At what moment return gunfire was opened is still uncertain. Some said within a minute, others within 5. But photos taken by the Japanese as late as 8:05 a.m. when California was torpedoed show not a single black burst of ack-ack in the sky, and all but 1 or 2 of the first wave of torpedo bombers got away unscathed. The Navy's machine guns at that time were not very effective. The 3-inch was not rapid fire enough, and the 1.1-inch was liable to heat and jam after a few rounds. It was not until next year that the 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors were installed. Oklahoma, outboard of the southernmost pair of battle wagons, one of our 1916 dreadnoughts, never had a chance to fight back. While the crew were running to battle stations, a few moments after the first bomb exploded on Ford Island, 3 torpedoes blasted huge holes in her, and she promptly listed 30 degrees. There was no time to set Condition Z, complete watertight integrity, or to counterflood, or to bring machine guns to bear. Before 8 a.m., the senior officer on board ordered abandon ship. Men crawled over the starboard side as she rolled over, and 2 more torpedo hits completed her doom. 15 minutes later, parts of her bottom were facing the sky. Many survivors climbed on board Maryland alongside to help her fight. She, protected by Oklahoma from the torpedoes, got off with only 2 bomb hits, and became the first of the stricken battle fleet to return to active service. Oklahoma lost 415 officers and men killed out of 1,354 on board. Tennessee and West Virginia made the next couple on Battleship Row. The latter, outboard, took 6 or 7 torpedoes, the first before 7:56 a.m. and 2 bombs. An exceptionally well-trained crew, who loved their weavy, as they called the ship, saved her from the fate of Oklahoma. Ensign Brooks, officer of the deck, saw the first bomb hit Ford Island and immediately ordered a wayfire and rescue party. This brought everyone topside on the double, and saved hundreds of lives. She listed so rapidly that the guns on the starboard side, which opened fire promptly, could be served only by organizing a double row of ammunition handlers, one to pass, and the other to hold the passer upright. Lieutenant Ricketts ordered counterflooding on his own initiative, and, ably assisted by boatswain's mate Billingsley, corrected a 28-degree list to 15 degrees. This allowed her to settle on the bottom almost upright. Captain Bennion, disemboweled by fragments from a bomb that exploded on Tennessee alongside, was in extremis. His only thoughts were for his ship and crew until his life flickered out a few minutes later. But his fighting spirit lived on. All hands fought fires, although frequently dive-bombed and strafed. Their spirit was marvelous, reported the surviving executive officer. Words fail in attempting to describe the magnificent display of courage, discipline, and devotion to duty of all. West Virginia lost 105 killed out of about 1,500 on board. Tennessee, moored inboard, naturally suffered less. She received 2 bombs early in the action, but most of her damage came from fires started by flaming debris from Arizona, exploding 75 feet astern. Firefighting continued all the rest of that day and the following night, and she did not sink. Her losses were only 5 killed, and within 3 weeks she, in company with Maryland and Pennsylvania, sailed to the west coast for a complete overhaul. Arizona was moored inboard of a short repair ship which afforded her slight protection. Within 1 minute of the opening attack, the battleship was literally torn apart by torpedo and bomb explosions. A bomb exploded in the forward magazine before it could be flooded, wrecking half the ship, killing Captain Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Kidd, who were on the bridge, and causing the ship to settle so fast that hundreds of sailors were trapped below. Even so, the machine guns topside opened fire on the enemy planes, and she was not abandoned until 10:32 a.m. Owing to lack of warning and to the magazine explosion, Arizona's casualties were over half those suffered by the entire fleet at Pearl Harbor, 1,103 officers and men killed out of some 1,400 on board. Her remains, and most of theirs, are still there today. She has never been formally decommissioned, and every day a colour guard faithfully raises and lowers the ensign on a mast built on a platform over the wreck. Battleship Row tapered off to a lone battle wagon at each end. Southernmost was California, flagship of Admiral Pye, and at the age of 20, youngest of the battle fleet. At 8:05 a.m. she was the last to be hit, but in the worst condition to take it, completely unbuttoned in preparation for an admiral's inspection, so that the 2 torpedoes that hit her, together with 1 bomb that exploded below and set off a magazine, were enough to cause her to settle into the mud. Prompt counterflooding, directed by Reserve Ensign Fair, prevented her from capsizing, which would have meant a far greater loss of life than the 98 officers and men actually killed. California was also restored to the fleet and performed excellent service in the latter half of the war. Nevada, at the northern end, oldest battleship present, well past her 25th birthday, had a little more grace than her immediate neighbours. Colour Guard began making morning colours, and the band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner before anything lethal came her way. A Kate that had torpedoed Arizona skimmed across her stern during the ceremony, and the rear gunner tried to strafe the sailors at attention, but managed only to rip the ensign. A second strafer came in, but the band finished the national anthem without a pause. Nobody broke ranks. Ensign Tausig, officer of the deck, then ordered battle stations, set condition Z, and Nevada went into action with her machine guns and port 5-inch battery. 1 and possibly 2 torpedo bombers were hit, and the rest gave Nevada a wide berth. But 1 torpedo tore a hole in her side, 45 by 30 feet. Prompt counterflooding corrected the list, and as her power plant was intact, Lieutenant Commander Francis J. Thomas, senior officer present, 8th in the chain of command, made the wise decision to get under way. In the meantime, she had taken 2 bomb hits amidships, causing many casualties and great damage. Ordinarily, 4 tugs were required to get a battleship under way from the mooring keys, but Nevada did it unaided. Chief Boatswain E.J. Hill jumped onto the quay, cast off the lines under strafing fire, and swam back to the ship. Down the ship channel she stood, fighting off dive bombers of the 2nd Japanese attack wave who concentrated on her, and at one time surrounded by a curtain of smoke and spray so dense that spectators thought her gone. But most of the bombs were near misses. A proud and gallant sight she made, with her tattered ensign streaming from the fantail. She could easily have gone to sea, but in the confusion Admiral Block or Kimmel, fearing lest she sink and block the channel, sent her an urgent signal not to leave the harbour. Commander Thomas then decided to anchor off Hospital Point. Just as she was about to drop the hook, dive bombers attacked and made 3 hits, one of which opened the forecastle like a sardine can and killed the entire anchoring detail, including Boatswain Hill. Nevada then slid gently aground. The captain now came on board and ordered her towed across the harbour to Waipio Point where, despite strenuous effort at damage control, she flooded and settled. 50 officers and men had been killed, and the old battle wagon was thoroughly wrecked topside. Floated in February, she steamed to Puget Sound under her own power, and, after modernization, rejoined the fleet in 1943. Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was happily in dry dock at the Navy Yard, and so could not be reached by torpedo bombers. She threw up powerful anti-aircraft fire, took but one severe bomb hit, and lost only 18 men. But several bombs meant for her hit destroyers Cassin and Downs in the same dry dock, and pretty well demolished them. Thus, in half an hour, the Japanese bombers accomplished their most important objective, wrecking the battle line of the Pacific Fleet beyond any possibility of offensive action within a year. Too much praise cannot be given to the officers and bluejackets in these and other ships. Once they had recovered from the initial surprise, they served their vessels nobly, and the damage control parties were especially effective. There was no flinching, no attempt to escape. On the contrary, from the moment of the first alarm, officers and men on leave in Honolulu and elsewhere began hastening to their stations. Dozens of barges, gigs, launches, and small yard craft took men out to their own ships, evacuated the wounded from the stricken vessels, and helped fight fires with complete disregard for their own safety. Chief Jansen, commanding YG-77, one of the yard's garbage lighters, received high praise for closing West Virginia to fight her fires until they were quenched, when he moved over to another post of danger, alongside Arizona. Ensign Sears of West Virginia was taken to the wrong ship, but jumped overboard and swam to his own to bear a hand. Chief Boatswain Hill of Nevada, and every one of his detail, and the exposed gunners of the 5 inches, fought like one man, and that man a hero, and almost every one of them lost his life. So, while we deplore the surprise, let us never forget the heroic reaction. That strife was not inglorious, though the event was dire. During the initial phase of the attack, between 7:55 a.m. and 8:25 a.m., the enemy inflicted severe punishment on military aircraft in Oahu. A flight of dive bombers worked over Ford Island, and in a few minutes Patrol Wing 2 lost 33 planes, almost half its number. At Ewa, the Marine Corps Air Base, halfway between West Loch and the ocean, some 50 planes were based. Captain Ashwell, officer of the day, was having breakfast when he heard aircraft, stepped out, sighted the first flight of torpedo bombers making for Battleship Row, immediately recognized them, and as he ran to the guardhouse to sound an alarm, saw 21 Zeke fighter planes roaring in over the Waianae Mountains. They struck Ewa before sprinting. Ashwell reached his goal. Swooping low, they attacked with short bursts of gunfire. The planes parked wing to wing and destroyed over 30 in a couple of minutes. By the time a second attack came in, the Marines had organized defense, dragging one undamaged plane to a good position to use as a machine gun mount, breaking out spare machine guns from ordnance rooms and wrenching them off damaged planes to set up elsewhere. These were able to keep the would-be strafers at a healthy distance and threw back a third attack by 15 Zeeks. Only 4 men were killed in these attacks, but the Marine air arm on Oahu was almost completely destroyed. Yamamoto had also placed the Indian sign on Kaneohe, a Navy patrol wing station on the windward side of Oahu. A squadron of Vals made for the Catalinas parked there at 7:55 a.m. Almost everyone was asleep. The duty officer thought they were army planes gone berserk and telephoned to Pearl Harbor for help. Another strike came in at 8:20 a.m., blasted a hangar and destroyed 3 Catalinas inside. An hour later, a third strike mopped up. As a result, 27 of the 36 PBYs at Kaneohe were destroyed and 6 more damaged. The 3 saved were out on patrol when the attack came in. 3 principal Army airfields on Oahu caught it badly. At Hickam, adjoining Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, a dozen A-20s, 33 B-18s and 6 B-17s were lined up in the open, wing to wing. A few seconds after 7:55 a.m., bombers earmarked to destroy them barreled in. One bomb crashed through the roof of the mess hall and exploded in the midst of the breakfast tables, killing 35 men. Others destroyed the parked planes. It was even more difficult to fight back ashore than on board ship, since many anti-aircraft guns spotted around Hickam and in the Navy Yard, all operated by the Army, were not manned, and none had ready ammunition. Soldiers had to run to the depots and break down doors to get bullets. Others wrenched machine guns off planes and blazed away. At Wheeler Field, in the central valley of Oahu, 62 P-40s and other planes too were parked as close as possible, in lines only 20 feet apart. Most of these were destroyed by 25 dive bombers which attacked at 8:02. Two small squadrons of P-40s at Bellows Field near Lanikai were also pretty much wiped out. Army Air Force had 231 aircraft on Oahu when the attack came in, but at close of day had only 166 units left, half of them damaged. Navy and Marine Corps had only 54 left out of about 250. From 8:25 a.m. to 8:40 a.m. there was a lull, broken only by a few laggards from the first wave. Then the second wave struck. It consisted of 50 Kates equipped for high-level bombing, 80 Val dive bombers, and 40 fighter planes. These came in around Diamond Head, concentrating largely on Hickam, on Nevada, and on other ships already hit. But this second wave of Japanese attackers was met by a lethal barrage of anti-aircraft fire and did comparatively little damage. The destroyers, which were moored in groups of 3 to 5 in East Loch, the cruisers tied up at docks in Southeast Loch, and the minecraft moored off the Naval Hospital in Middle Loch were underway by this time and escaped serious damage. At 9:45 all Japanese planes over Oahu returned to their carriers. All but 29 got back, though some 70 were shot full of holes. One plane crash-landed on the island of Niihau, where the pilot, with the aid of a local Japanese, managed to terrorize the unarmed native populace for a week. At the end of that time, a burly Hawaiian grappled with the pilot, and although shot by him in diverse places, managed to kill him with bare hands and a stone. By the end of 2 morning hours on 7 December, the Navy had lost over 2,000 officers and men killed and 710 wounded, about thrice as many as in the two wars of 1898 and 1917 to 1918. The Army and Marine Corps together lost 327 killed and 433 wounded. In addition, some 70 civilians were killed, mostly men who happened to be on one of the airfields, but some in Honolulu, where a few naval anti-aircraft shells, whose fuses in the confusion had not been cut, exploded on city streets. The rest of this terrible day was passed in expectation of worse to come. Japanese ships were reported to be on every side of Oahu, preparing to land troops. In the Hawaiian Islands were 160,000 people of Japanese blood. Surely from among them Black Dragon bands had been recruited to assassinate Americans. Japanese maids and butlers, it was said, told their employers to scram, as their house had been assigned to a Japanese general. Every one of these rumors was later found to be false, and not one disloyal act was committed by the local Nipponese. General Short, for whom that day marked the end of a distinguished army career, promptly executed his plans for deployment in the event of enemy attack. At about 1,000, army contingents in trucks or afoot began to move toward the supposed danger spots, now that the danger had passed. Sunset over the Pacific inaugurated a hideous night for all hands. Firefighting continued on many of the stricken ships. Surgeons and nurses in the overcrowded hospitals were up all night attending the wounded and dying. Hundreds of women and children whose husbands' quarters had been bombed huddled miserably in the university auditorium or in a storage tunnel at Red Hill. Trigger-happy sentries and machine gunners fired at everything that moved, supposing it to be a Japanese invader. Saddest of all accidents was the shooting down at night of 4 dive bombers from carrier Enterprise. These had landed at Ford Island during the morning lull, and were then sent out to search for the enemy. When they returned after nightfall with running lights on, an anti-aircraft gunner, who failed to get the word because the airbase communications had been ruptured, opened fire and started a panic of shooting all around the harbour. Daybreak 8. December revealed a dismal situation, waste and wild. Half the aircraft on the island destroyed, 7 battleships sunk or badly damaged, 3 destroyers reduced to junk, and the atmosphere was one of tormenting uncertainty. Nobody knew where the Japanese task force was. The one radar fix on it was interpreted 180 degrees wrong. So many a ship and most of the flyable planes were sent scurrying southward, but as the days elapsed, one saw that the situation might well have been worse. Our 3 aircraft carriers were safe. The repair shops, which did an amazingly quick job on damaged ships, were almost untouched, as was the fuel oil tank farm, filled to capacity, whose loss would have tied up the fleet for months. Nevertheless, the armed forces and the nation had been struck a treacherous, devastating, and humiliating blow. When someone in Washington proposed that a medal be issued to Pearl Harbor combatants, one of the survivors replied, "Better make the ribbon of black crepe." The Pearl Harbor disaster made a tremendous emotional impact on the American people. The Japanese High Command, by their idiotic act, had made a strategic present of the First Order to the United States. They had united the country in grim determination to win victory in the Pacific. Isolationism and pacifism now ceased to be valid forces in American politics, but some of their exponents, and many well-meaning people too, became violent propagandists for the bizarre theory that the Roosevelt administration, with the connivance of leading generals and admirals in Washington, knew perfectly well that the attack was coming, and deliberately withheld knowledge of it from Kimmel and Short in order, for their own foul purposes, to get us into the war. Even if one can believe that the late President of the United States was capable of so horrible a gambit, a little reflection would indicate that he could not possibly have carried it off. He would have needed the connivance of Secretaries Hull, Stimson and Knox, Generals Marshall, Gero and Miles, Admirals Stark, Turner and Wilkinson, and many of their subordinates too, all loyal and honourable men who would never have lent themselves to such monstrous deception. More reflection might suggest that if Roosevelt and his cabinet ministers and armed service chiefs had schemed to get us into the war, their purpose would have been better served by warning the Hawaiian commanders in time to get the fleet to sea and the planes airborne. Even a frustrated attempt to strike Pearl Harbor would have been sufficient casus belli to satisfy the most isolationist congressman. Actually, the administration and the heads of the armed forces, as we have seen, were doing their best to prevent or postpone a war with Japan. Roosevelt even sent a personal appeal to Hirohito on the evening of 6 December. After any overwhelming disaster, there is a search for the culprit, and this search is still being pursued for partisan purposes, after 2 Navy and 2 Army investigations, and a lengthy congressional one have combed every phase of a mission and commission. No military event in our or any other country's history, not even the battles of Gettysburg and Jutland, has been the subject of such exhaustive research as the air assault on Pearl Harbor. A principal reason why Washington and Pearl Harbor were caught unawares was their inability to imagine that Japan would do anything so stupid and suicidal. But Joseph Grew in Tokyo, one of the most alert and perceptive ambassadors in United States history, warned Washington on 3 November 1941 against any possible misconception of the capacity of Japan to rush headlong into a suicidal conflict with the United States. National sanity would dictate against such an event, but Japanese sanity cannot be measured by our own standards of logic. Japan's resort to war measures may come with dramatic and dangerous suddenness. Grew's warning fell on deaf ears. 3 weeks later, almost everyone in a responsible position in Washington expected Japan to make an aggressive move on the weekend of 29 November, but not on Pearl Harbor. And the curious lethargy into which official Washington seemed to fall after the war warning is partly explained by the decrypting of a whole series of dispatches from Tokyo to its ambassadors, to the effect that the deadline was approaching, time was running out, etc. There were no fewer than 19 such messages between 2 and 26 November, yet nothing had happened. The Army and Navy cryptographers in Washington were experts, but grossly overworked. The stuff was coming in faster than they could deal with it, and one could not tell which dispatch was important and which was not until all were decrypted. A message from the Japanese consulate at Honolulu dated 6 December, which ended, "There is a considerable opportunity to take advantage for a surprise attack against these places. Pearl Harbor and vicinity," was not decrypted until after the attack. The berthing plan message and Honolulu's replies were not assigned their proper significance at Washington, because they were mixed in with hundreds of messages which had to be decrypted and translated from all parts of the world. Observers in China, for instance, were sending as many as 50 messages a week, warning of forthcoming Japanese attacks on Siberia, Peru, and other unlikely places. Army and Navy intelligence officers in Washington were somewhat in the position of a woman with a sick child, trying to take instructions from a doctor over the telephone while the neighbours are shouting contrary advice in her ear. Dogs are barking, children screaming, and trucks roaring by the house. The noise overwhelmed the message. Personalities also entered into it. Rear Admiral Turner, Navy War Plans officer, was highly opinionated and difficult to work with. He actually forbade the Japanese language officers who did the decrypting and translating, or even the Chief of Naval Intelligence, to make estimates from the dispatches, insisting on doing that himself. And Turner, until late November, was obsessed by the idea that Japan was going to attack Russia, not American or British possessions. Intelligence data received in Washington was handled in a manner that dissipated its impact. Copies of all decrypted messages that the translators thought significant, sometimes running to 130 a day, were placed in locked briefcases and carried by special messengers to the President, the Secretaries of State, War and Navy, and about 6 top-ranking members of the armed forces. The recipient, without taking notes, had to read these signals in the presence of the messenger, who returned them to Army or Navy Intelligence Office, where all copies but one were burned. This system, devised for security, denied to all these important people the opportunity to digest data and draw conclusions. It was nobody's particular and exclusive business to study all intelligence material and come up with an estimate. Nobody got anything but excerpts and driblets. It must also be remembered that in the late months of 1941, all High Army, Navy and State Department officials in Washington were deeply concerned with the short-of-war conflict in the Atlantic and with Europe, where it then seemed probable that Hitler would gobble up Russia as he had France, order American merchantmen to be sunk, and step up his subversive activities in Central and South America. Every one of the Japanese messages decrypted and translated before 7 December was ambiguous. None mentioned Pearl Harbor. None even pointed clearly at Japanese intent to attack the United States anywhere. Thus, no clear warnings were sent to Hawaii because Washington saw no reason to anticipate an attack on Hawaii. Washington, moreover, was determined not to begin a war with Japan. That was the meaning of the passage in the diary of War Secretary Stimson, recording the cabinet meeting of 25 November, after one of Tojo's deadline messages had been decrypted and translated. The President predicted that we were likely to be attacked perhaps next Monday. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot. This quotation has been made much of by those trying to prove conspiracy between Franklin D. Roosevelt and his cabinet to get us into war. Mr. Stimson's use of the verb maneuver was unfortunate, but his intent is clear. We were not going to provoke the Japanese by an overt act. Peace would continue until and unless they chose to strike. This was exactly the same attitude as President Lincoln's about Fort Sumter, or, to go further back, Colonel Parker's classic speech to the Minutemen at Lexington on 19 April 1775, "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Pearl Harbor, besides lacking the complete intelligence picture, had the additional handicap of divided responsibility. General Short was charged with the defense of Oahu, including Pearl Harbor and anti-aircraft batteries ashore. Admiral Bloch, Commandant 14th Naval District, was responsible for the defense of the Navy Yard, and Admiral Kimmel for that of the fleet. Relations between them were friendly but inadequate. Each one, as we have seen, assumed that the others were doing something that they didn't do. A series of false assumptions, both at Washington and Oahu, added up to something as serious as the sins of omission. In Hawaii, the Navy assumed that the Army had gone on full alert and that the radar warning net was completely operational. The Army assumed that the Navy was conducting an effective air reconnaissance around the island. Admiral Kimmel assumed that aerial torpedoes could not operate in the shoal waters of Pearl Harbor. Both Army and Navy intelligence officers assumed that Japan was sending all her naval forces south, and that in any event Japan would not be so stupid as to attack Pearl Harbor. In Washington, Colonel Bratton of Army Intelligence assumed that the Pacific Fleet would go to sea after the 27 November war warning, so to him the intercepted reports of ships' positions by the Japanese consulate registered waste effort, and Captain Wilkinson of Naval Intelligence assumed that these reports were simply evidence of the Japanese inordinate love for detail. Rear Admiral Turner of War Plans assumed that this and all other relevant intelligence was going to Admiral Kimmel, and General Guerreau of Army War Plans assumed that Kimmel and Short were exchanging every scrap of what they did get, which was considerable. Washington was as vague and uncertain about what was going to happen on the first or second weekend after 27 November as Pearl Harbor itself. It was a case of the blind mot leading the blind, false assumptions at both ends of the line. The gravest charge against Admiral Kimmel and General Short is that they virtually ignored the war warning dispatch of 27 November from Washington. Admiral Kimmel, as we have seen, did send air reinforcement promptly to Wake and Midway Islands. He had already, with Admiral Block's cooperation, set up the surface and air patrol off the mouth of Pearl Harbor, which encountered the midget submarines. He had, on 14 October, warned the fleet against a submarine attack as a herald of something worse. Thus the charge whittles down to this, that he did not repeat this warning and beef up air patrol after 27 November. He thought that he had done everything that could reasonably be expected, in view of the intelligence received. Nevertheless, an unwarranted feeling of immunity from attack prevailed in Oahu at the crucial moment, as Admiral King observed, and it is not unfair to hold Kimmel and Short responsible. Finally, we have to consider the east wind rain dispatch, which, by people bent on proving dastardly deception by Washington, has been blown up to a definite word from Tokyo that Pearl Harbor was about to be attacked. Actually, it was nothing of the sort. On 19 November, Tokyo notified the principal Japanese representatives abroad, in a dispatch that Washington decrypted, that if all other means of communication failed, they would be ordered to destroy codes in a plain language weather broadcast. In this broadcast, east wind, rain would mean Japanese-United States relations in danger. North wind, cloudy, would mean the same as to Russia. West wind, clear, would mean the same as to England. There was no mention of Pearl Harbor or any other target, not even a clear forecast of war. This wind's message, however, was taken seriously in Washington, where a number of officers were alerted to watch Japanese broadcasts for the false weather forecast. Whether or not that was ever sent is disputed, but in no case would it have told Washington or Hawaii anything more than what they already knew, namely that Japanese embassies had been ordered to destroy their codes. Fundamentally, however, it was the system, the setup both at Washington and at Pearl, rather than individual stupidity or apathy, which muffled and confused what was going on. No one person knew the whole picture that the intelligence data disclosed. No one person was responsible for the defense of Pearl Harbor. Too many people assumed that others were taking precautions that they did not take. There is an old saying, "Give every dog 2 bites," but Kimmel and Short were not even allowed one. They were relieved from active duty forthwith. Admiral Turner, however, was conceded 2 bites, Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Savo Island, after which he became a highly successful practitioner of amphibious warfare. General Marshall functioned brilliantly as Chief of Staff, and Admiral Stark, as Commander United States Naval Forces Europe in London, acquitted himself very well. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were so shaken by the attack that they had to be relieved anyway, but they might, with justice, have been given honourable commands elsewhere. Since World War II, the methods and systems of obtaining military intelligence and, what is more important, evaluating it and seeing that the proper people get it, have been vastly improved. But let us not forget that we were surprised by the North Koreans in June 1950, surprised when China entered the war later that year, surprised in 1961 by discovery of the attempt to overthrow Castro in Cuba, surprised by the building of the East Berlin Wall in a tense international situation such as we have been in ever since the end of World War II. It is important not only to gather intelligence, but to see that the right people get it and to have it evaluated intelligently. It is vital to ascertain not only the capabilities of a potential enemy, but his intentions. So I conclude this sad story of disaster with the warning which Sophocles, over 23 centuries ago in his tragedy of the Siege of Troy, placed in the mouth of Ajax. Far-stretching, endless time brings forth all hidden things, and buries that which once did shine. The firm resolve falters, the sacred oath is shattered, and let none say it cannot happen here. One of the strange things in popular psychology is the different reaction of the American people to disaster at Pearl Harbor and to disaster at Manila. The one completely overshadowed the other. It seemed so overwhelming that people could take in no bad news elsewhere. Yet the attack on Pearl Harbor was the lesser of the two evils. It was a hit-and-run raid, and the hit was not decisive. By 1000 December 7, the Japanese planes had retired, and they never returned, nor was there any attempt by the enemy to land troops on Oahu and take over. All we had to do was to count the losses, begin salvage, and bury the dead. In the Philippines, the events of 7 December here, 8 December there, were not so devastating as at Oahu, but they proved to be but the first of a series of body blows and what blows. General MacArthur's army forced to evacuate Manila and Admiral Hart's fleet to evacuate Cavite. After a rearguard campaign, the entire Philippine archipelago surrendered to Japan. General MacArthur retired to Australia, nor were these all. Defeat at Pearl Harbor brought no immediate consequences except the capture of Wake Island. But the Japanese blitz in the Philippines was followed by the seizure of Guam, Hong Kong, Thailand, North Borneo, Singapore, and, after a last-ditch campaign in the Java Sea, the entire Netherlands East Indies. Our inability to defend the Philippines in 1941 to 1942 cost us tens of thousands of lives and uncounted billions of dollars before the archipelago could be liberated in 1944 to 1945. If surprise at Pearl Harbor is hard to understand, surprise at Manila is completely incomprehensible. Some 8 or 9 hours after General MacArthur was informed of the attack on Pearl Harbor, his planes were caught grounded, and his air force was as badly destroyed as that of the army at Pearl Harbor. Yet General MacArthur was given a second bite. His mistakes on 8 December were overlooked, fortunately. Again and again, since the turn of the century, American military commanders in the Philippines had warned that, with the meagre forces assigned, they could not possibly defend the archipelago against Japan. Their plan, in case of war, was to abandon Manila, retire the army to Bataan, but to defend Manila Bay from Corregidor and other small island fortresses until the Pacific Fleet managed to arrive on the scene. This plan and attitude changed after General MacArthur became Commander United States Army Forces Far East in July 1941. The general convinced army authorities in Washington that if properly reinforced before war broke out, and if the clash could be postponed until the spring of 1942, his army and the United States Asiatic Fleet could keep the Japanese out of Luzon until the Pacific Fleet arrived. His opinion was based on the hope and expectation that his command would receive at least 100 B-17s. The performance of these flying fortresses was so outstanding that in October 1941, General MacArthur advised the War Department that the citadel type of defense of the Philippines, as envisaged by the Rainbow Five War Plan, be changed to a dynamic and offensive plan. MacArthur's enthusiasm was infectious. General Marshall told him to go ahead with new plans, which provided for an offensive strike by B-17s on the Formosa airfields when and if war came with Japan. The Chief of Staff, at a press conference in Washington on 15 November 1941, told selected correspondents that we were on the brink of war with Japan, that our position was highly favorable in the Philippines. There we had 35 B-17s, greatest concentration of heavy bomber strength anywhere in the world, which could counterattack, set the paper cities of Japan afire, and make the Philippines garrison independent of sea power. General MacArthur's opposite number on the naval side was Admiral Thomas C. Hart, Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet. Small, taut, wiry, and irascible, Admiral Hart was a year older than Admiral King and had served 44 years in the Navy. In the autumn of 1940, he transferred most of his small fleet from China to Manila Bay. The Asiatic Fleet in the existing war plan was responsible for the naval defense of the Philippines. It must support the army there so long as that defense continues. Its total strength when war broke was a heavy cruiser Houston, 2 light cruisers, 13 World War I destroyers, 28 submarines, and a number of auxiliaries. Obviously, all that this fleet could do in the event of a Japanese invasion of the Philippines was to retire or fight a delaying action. Tommy Hart, a real fighter, preferred the second alternative, but on 20 November the Navy Department ordered him to fall back. The Admiral then began deployment southward of all except his submarines, which were wanted to repel invasion, and Seaplane Wing 10 of PBYs, which were wanted for reconnaissance. On 8 December, 4 destroyers, 6 river gunboats, 5 bird-class minesweepers, 2 fleet oilers, floating dry dock, Dewey, and a couple of tugs were still in Manila Bay. The 4th Marine Regiment was also in barracks at Cavite. Admiral Hart tried his best to remove Marines of the China Embassy Guard in time, and did get most of them out in river gunboat Wake, but merchant ship President Harrison, sent for the rest, was captured by the Japanese on 8 December. Both commanders in the Philippines took the 27 November war warning very seriously and expected the blow to come soon. Ocean search by the PBYs was stepped up, and General MacArthur ordered all flying fortresses around Manila to be flown to Davao Field, Mindanao, for safety from a surprise air attack. But by 7 December only about half of them had gone, because room had to be left at the small Mindanao base for more B-17s expected presently from Hawaii. Nevertheless, the new war plan called for a counterattack on the Formosan airfields as soon as Japan made war, or declared war. News of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Admiral Hart's headquarters in Manila at 2:30 a.m. December 8, East Longitude date, which was 8 a.m. December 7, Hawaiian time. There was nothing he could do but alert the Asiatic fleet to prepare for air attack. General MacArthur got the word about an hour later, and official confirmation arrived from Washington at 5:30 a.m. At dawn, a flight of 22 planes from Japanese carrier Ryujo attacked United States seaplane tender William B. Preston in Davao Gulf, Mindanao. That overt act inaugurated war in the Philippines. At 9:30 a.m., 2 flights of bombers from Formosa struck Baguio and the Tuguegarao airfield in northern Luzon. So there was no possible doubt that we were at war with Japan, or that the Philippines were on her list for conquest. Yet, in the face of this, there was hesitation at Manila about unleashing the B-17s against Formosa, or the fighter planes to intercept a bomber strike from Formosa that might reasonably be expected at any moment. General Sutherland, General MacArthur's Chief of Staff, and General Brereton, commanding MacArthur's Army Air Forces, have given each other the lie as to why the planned attack on Formosa was not promptly executed. Each claims that he wanted to do it, but that the other dragged his feet, or his wings, insisting that first there be a photographic reconnaissance of the Formosa airfields, and why had that not been done earlier? The surprise at Manila has never been thoroughly investigated, and Dr. Louis Morton, the official army historian, failed to get to the bottom of it. This naval historian can only venture a guess that the real trouble was bad blood between Sutherland and Brereton, of which, unfortunately, General MacArthur seems to have been ignorant. Whatever the cause, by 11:30 a.m. almost all B-17s and fighter planes were grounded on Clark, Nichols, Iba, and other fields of the airdrome complex around Manila. The ground crews then began arming the bombers for a raid on Formosa, which had finally been ordered to take place that afternoon, and the pilots went to lunch. A force of 108 twin-engine Japanese bombers, escorted by 34 fighters, was then well on its way from Formosa to Manila. At about 11:30 a.m., warnings of this approaching strike, from observers in northern Luzon, began to reach the Air Force plotting board at Nielsen Field. Thence, about a quarter of an hour later, a warning message was ordered sent to Clark and other fields by teletype. Some claim that it never did go out, that the radio operator was at lunch. Nevertheless, one pursuit squadron of American fighter planes took off promptly from Iba Field, and another was just about to take off from Clark. At 12:15 p.m., when the first group of 27 Japanese bombers appeared, their delighted pilots found the B-17s all lined up like sitting ducks, dropped their bombs from about 22,000 feet altitude, and were off and away. Then came a similar formation which bombed for 15 minutes, completely unmolested by American anti-aircraft, whose ancient ammunition, vintage 1932, and corroded bomb fuses could not reach so high. Finally came a full hour's strafing attack by 34 fighter planes. The scene was one of horror and destruction, relieved by many acts of individual heroism similar to those of the victims at Pearl Harbor. Iba Field was struck by 54 Japanese planes, just as the pursuit squadron, which had gone forth a little before noon, was about to land. That squadron gave a good account of itself, but lost all but 2 of its planes. Total losses to our side were 18 of the 35 B-17s present, destroyed, 56 fighter planes, 25 miscellaneous aircraft, and many installations destroyed, 8 men killed and 150 wounded at a cost to the enemy of only 7 fighters. After 1 day of war, and despite ample warning, the Far Eastern Air Force as an effective combat unit had been eliminated. After this debacle, there was no possibility of a counterattack, and Japan retained the initiative she had so easily won. December 9 was comparatively quiet, but the 10th was Navy Day for the enemy, who sent part of an 80-bomber and 52-fighter group to rub out the Cavite Navy Yard. While a substantial segment of this attack group neutralized airfields, some 54 bombers flew back and forth over Cavite at 20,000 feet elevation, beyond the range of our 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, bombing at will. The Navy Yard and a large part of the city of Cavite were completely destroyed, as were a dockside submarine, a minesweeper, and the entire reserve stock of submarines' torpedoes. On 12 December, all the PBYs of Patwing 10, returning from a fruitless search for an enemy carrier force that wasn't there, were destroyed by Japanese Zero fighters at their Olongapo moorings. The surviving aviators were sent south. The United States Navy had completely lost control of the waters and air surrounding Luzon. No supplies or reinforcements could reach MacArthur's army ever. Let us humbly remember this humiliating fact, and not bury it under the memory of MacArthur's gallantry or the Navy's part in spearheading his return to the Philippines. Across the South China Sea, the Royal Netherlands Navy and the Royal British were faring no better. Japan actually began hostilities in that quarter 2 days before her strike on Pearl Harbor. Minelayer Tatsumiya Maru, beginning on the evening of 6 December, east longitude date, laid 456 mines in British territorial waters between Tumen Island and the Malay Peninsula, not far from Singapore. This was done to protect the forthcoming Japanese landings on that peninsula from interference by British ships in Singapore. Netherlands submarine O-16 and probably K-17 too were sunk in this minefield in mid-December. Worse things had already happened. Japanese bombers based on Indochina sank His Majesty battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse on 10 December. By that time, Japanese forces had already landed on the Malay Peninsula, taken Hong Kong from the British and Guam from us. Nor is this all that happened on the 10th, which should be regarded as an even greater day of infamy than the 7th at Pearl Harbor. On that day, the Japanese executed the first of their 5 amphibious landings on Luzon at Apari. The others coming up were at Vigan and Legazpi, 11th and 12th, Lingayen, 21st, and Layman Bay, 24th. The pitifully few ships and aircraft of Admiral Hart's fleet were unable to prevent the enemy from landing whenever and wherever he chose, or even to delay his timetable of conquest. Not that Asiatic fleet failed to try. Its submarines were deployed to intercept the landings, and sank a couple of transports or freighters. But that did not stop the Japanese. Our efforts only served to prove that a properly equipped amphibious force cannot be stopped by submarines alone, and a Japanese amphibious group led by Rear Admiral Tanaka in light cruiser Jintsu, of whom and of which we shall hear much more, landed at Davao, Mindanao on 20 December, and then proceeded to take Jolo. Japanese air forces so completely controlled the air over Manila Bay that reinforcements could not be brought in by sea, and the B-17s fleeted up from Mindanao were soon expended. On 21 December, Rear Admiral Francis W. Rockwell, Commandant 16th Naval District, established new headquarters in a tunnel on the rock Corregidor. On Christmas Eve, General MacArthur decided to evacuate Manila, daily being bombed, and to deploy his army in the ultimate defense area, the Bataan Peninsula. Admiral Hart at the same time ordered the only 2 destroyers left in Manila Bay to Java, where Rear Admiral William A. Glassford, in cruiser Marblehead, was rallying the Asiatic fleet. Hart himself departed for Java in submarine Shark the day after Christmas, leaving tender Canopus and a handful of minecraft, gunboats and motor torpedo boats under Admiral Rockwell to be expended. That they were covering the flanks of the army in its stubborn defence of Bataan. There was no lack of individual bravery. A colourful character, Commander Francis J. Bridget of an already expended PBY squadron, organised a weird naval battalion of about 200 men from grounded aviators, Marines, Filipinos, or anyone who would join. Wearing white Navy uniforms dyed bright yellow, these tough hombres not only protected General MacArthur's headquarters at Mariveles from capture by one Japanese landing force several times their strength, but forced a second Japanese group to hole up in caves on the coastal cliff, whence they were disinfected by Lieutenant John D. Bulkley's PT boats. It was no use. On 21 February 1942, submarine Swordfish took President Quezon of the Philippine Commonwealth out of danger, and on 11 March, on orders from Washington, Lieutenant Bulkeley's PT carried General MacArthur and Admiral Rockwell to Mindanao, whence B-17s flew them to Australia. General Jonathan M. Wainwright, left in command of the army, evacuated Bataan on 8 April to Corregidor. The Rock, gallantly defended by Colonel S. L. Howard's 4th Marines and the remnants of the army, held out for another month. Finally, on 6 May came the bitterest event of all, when General Wainwright, hoping to prevent further effusion of blood, surrendered Corregidor and all armed forces in the Philippines to the enemy. This was the greatest surrender in American history, not excepting Appomattox. But unlike that one, in which the southern dream of empire faded, Corregidor inspired a grim determination on the part of General MacArthur to return, and of the country to see that he did return, in sufficient force to reverse the verdict. A new bond of brotherhood between Americans and Filipinos was forged, and it has never since been sundered. By the new year, Japan could afford to neglect the Philippines, since both United States and Commonwealth forces there were completely neutralized, and to the southward Japan was fast realizing her bold scheme of conquest. England, the Netherlands, and America had to fight for the Malay Barrier, a name then applied to the string of big islands from the Malay Peninsula to New Guinea, most of them belonging to the Netherlands East Indies. If Japan got possession of these rich territories, teeming with oil, rubber, and other strategic materials, she would be well-nigh self-sufficient. And once in control of the Molucca, Sunda, Lombok, and other straits between the islands, the warriors of Nippon might pour into the Indian Ocean and threaten British India and Australia. In April 1941, an attempt was made to arrive at an international staff agreement about the conduct of war in the Far East, similar to the Anglo-American one at Washington. Representatives of the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Australia, and New Zealand met at Singapore. This conference came to no useful result, largely because of divergent views about Singapore itself. The British had spent vast sums on creating the military and naval base there, and regarded it as a symbol of empire, a pledge to the Antipodes that England in her time of greatest peril had not forgotten them. Rear Admiral Turner and other Americans took a dim view of Singapore as a strategic base. Owing to its lack of defences on the land side, they predicted that Singapore could not long hold out in the event of war with Japan, nor did it. Even after His Majesty's ship Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk, the British continued to insist that Singapore must and could be defended. Divergent aims bedevilled the new American-British-Dutch-Australia Combined Command, set up on 15 January 1942, throughout the 6 stormy weeks of its existence. The British wanted more troops to be poured into Singapore, and to use the combined naval forces to escort them. The Dutch wished to protect their East Indies, the Australians to prevent an invasion of their country, and the Americans to prepare a comeback. Thus, American-British-Dutch-Australia as a combined command was very creaky at the joints. Communication and language difficulties were never solved. No combined system of signalling was worked out. The native Indonesians, unlike the Filipinos, were apathetic or hostile. The Supreme American-British-Dutch-Australia commander, Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, had proved himself in Africa to be one of England's most distinguished soldiers. But here he failed, as anyone under like conditions would have failed. Under Wavell, Admiral Hart commanded the combined naval forces, a Dutch Lieutenant General the ground forces, and a British Air Chief Marshal the air forces. The Asiatic Fleet was now based at Surabaya on the north coast of Java, and its principal units were organised into the American-British-Dutch-Australia striking force under Vice Admiral Helfrich of the Royal Netherlands Navy. Port Darwin, Australia, 1,200 miles distant, was the nearest service and supply base for the United States Asiatic Fleet. 2 powerful Japanese attack groups, the eastern under Vice Admiral Takahashi and the western under Vice Admiral Ozawa, composed of heavy cruisers and destroyers escorting army transports, and with Admiral Nagumo's still intact carriers of the Pearl Harbor striking force in wide-ranging support, slithered into the Netherlands East Indies, like the arms of 2 giant octopi. The Western Octopus worked down the South China Sea to North Borneo and Sumatra. the eastern to East Borneo, the Celebes, Ambon, Timor and Bali. Aircraft would pound down a beachhead, amphibious forces would then move in and activate another airfield and soften up the next objective for invasion. Nothing possessed by the three Allied powers could stop this grim process. Dutch and United States submarines inflicted considerable damage, but the enemy forces were overwhelming. The Allies, owing to their diverse interests, dissipated their forces in various directions and on gallant but futile missions. Commander Paul Talbot in John D. Ford, with 3 other World War I destroyers, broke into the Japanese force landing at Balikpapan, Borneo, on the night of 23 to 24 January 1942. And he sank 4 Maras and a patrol craft, but this did not delay the Japanese timetable by even a day. By 3 February, Japanese airplanes, now established at Kondari in the Celebes, began raiding Surabaya, forcing Admiral Hart to send his tenders south to Cilacap. None too soon, for light cruiser Marblehead was so badly mauled off Bangka next day that she had to be sent home. Another air-surface battle between planes from carrier Ryujo and an American-British-Dutch-Australia striking force under Admiral Dorman on 15 February forced the ships to retire through Gaspar Strait to the Java Sea. And on that very day, Singapore surrendered, as bitter a draught for Britain as Pearl Harbor had been for America. Now, in quick succession, the Japanese occupied Timor and Nagumo's carrier planes bombed Port Darwin, heavily damaging the Allied supply ships and forcing the abandonment of that port as a supply base. The Octopi would soon put the final squeeze on Java. By the time they were ready for that, American, British, Dutch, Australia Command had been reorganized upon the floor, like the person described in T.S. Eliot's Sweeney among the Nightingales. Admiral Hart had been a good skipper in a bad storm, using the little that he had to fight to best advantage, but on 12 February, owing to the Netherlands government's desire that in their East Indies a Dutch admiral should be in command, Tommy Hart was relieved by Admiral Helfrich. This change did not help the desperately bad situation. All fighting ships and sailors had been worked beyond their capacity. Facilities for repairs were inadequate at Surabaya and almost non-existent at Cilacap on the south coast of Java, which most of the Asiatic fleet now had to use as base, owing to frequent air attacks on the north coast ports. Field Marshal Wavell was ordered home and on 25 February departed. General Brereton of the United States Army Air Force had already gone, together with most of the planes that he had managed to evacuate from the Philippines. Units of the British, of United States, and of the Netherlands Navy remained. American, British, Dutch, Australia no longer existed, in fact, only in theory. Dutch officers were now in full control of all armed forces left in the area. Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman now commanded the striking force of the 3 Allied navies, based at Surabaya. It was far from negligible as a fighting array. Heavy cruisers Houston and His Majesty's ship Exeter, light cruisers His Majesty's Australian ship Perth, His Majesty's Netherlands ship De Ruyter and Java, 4 American, 3 British and 3 Dutch destroyers. Collectively, these ships were not strong enough to stop the major Japanese thrust, and they had never worked together as a team. Iwo massive amphibious forces were approaching, 56 transport types under Rear Admiral Ozawa to the westward, and 41 under Rear Admiral Nishimura to the eastward. And the eastern one, which Dorman hoped to intercept since it seemed headed for Surabaya, was covered by a formidable support force under Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, which included heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro, and 2 destroyer squadrons with light cruiser flagships, Naka and Jintsu, under Rear Admirals Nishimura and Tanaka. Vice Admiral Nagumo's Pearl Harbor striking force was hovering in the Indian Ocean to prevent reinforcement from that quarter and took no part in the battle. The air component was supplied by the Japanese cruisers' float planes. Their spotting and after dark illuminating may well have tipped the scales, for Dorman had no aircraft whatsoever. He had left his float planes ashore on the 26th, expecting a night battle, and when he called for air support from Java, the air commander there stupidly sent his few light bombers and fighters to make a fruitless attack on the Japanese transports. Admiral Dorman, a fine type of fighting sailor, was about to enter Surabaya for rest and replenishment when he received reports of 2 Japanese convoys, the nearer but 8 miles distant. At 3:25 p.m. February 27 striking force reversed course to give battle in waters between the north coast of Java and Bawean Island, which the Japanese had already taken. Dorman had no time to issue a battle plan, much less to distribute it, and there was confusion and delay from the necessity of translating every signal. About the only command that Dorman could get across during the battle was "Follow me," and every ship that could, did. His object was simple enough: to beat off or get around Takagi's fighting ships and raise havoc among the transports waiting just over the northern horizon. Takagi's object, naturally, was to prevent this and clear the way for the invasion of Java. The battle was such a series of thrusts and parries, bursts of gunfire and shoals of torpedoes over a period of 5 or 6 hours that it is difficult to follow. The Allied order of battle: 3 British destroyers, Encounter, Electra, Jupiter in the van. Her Netherlands, Majesty's ship, De Ruyter. Dorman's ship, followed by His Majesty's ship Exeter, USS Houston. His Majesty's Australian ship Perth. Her Netherlands, Majesty's ship Java in column. 2 Dutch destroyers, Witte de With and Courtenaire on the left flank, and 4 Americans, John D. Edwards, Alden, John D. Ford, Paul Jones in the rear. It was a calm, clear day with high visibility and a slight swell. At 4:12 p.m. the enemy was sighted, in 3 columns, Tanaka's Jintsu and 7 destroyers on the right flank, Takagi's 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro in the centre, Nishimura's Naka and 6 destroyers on the left flank. At 4:16 a.m. firing commenced between the 2 heavy groups at the extreme range of 28,000 yards, almost 14 miles. Tanaka's destroyer squadron closed Electra and Jupiter to 18,000 yards and straddled them, but they could not reach him with their 4.7-inch guns. As Dorman's course, if continued, would enable the Japanese to emulate Admiral Togo's famous Tsushima crossing of the T, the Netherlands admiral changed course from northwest to west to parallel the enemy, and endeavoured to close range so that his 3 light cruisers could use their 6-inch guns. In the gunfire duel that ensued, the Japanese, with planes spotting for them, had the advantage, and at 4:31 p.m. made the first hit, fortunately a dud, on De Ruyter. Takagi now ordered the first torpedo attack, and he had 18 ships to launch from, as all Japanese cruisers carried torpedoes. Over a period of 19 minutes, 4:33 p.m. to 4:52 p.m., the Japanese launched 43 of their fast, powerful long lances, but made not one hit. The range was too great. Both forces sped westward at about 25 knots or more, firing furiously but not hitting. This battle showed something that became increasingly evident during World War II, the ineffectiveness of naval gunfire at high speed and great range. Again, the Japanese took the initiative. At 5 p.m., bold Tanaka peeled off to cross Dorman's bows and make a second torpedo attack. He would have had little chance to score against the thin frontal silhouette of Dorman's column, but for a cruiser's 8-inch hit at 5:08 p.m. on His Majesty's ship Exeter, which put 6 of her 8 boilers out, slowed her down and caused her to sheer out of line, about 90 degrees to port. Houston, Perth and Java, assuming that Dorman, whom they could not see in the smoke, must have ordered a 90-degree left turn, followed suit, and so flagship De Ruyter, after continuing west for a minute or 2, had to do the same. As a result, the Allied force became scattered in a confused pattern right slap into Tanaka's torpedo water. He could hardly fail to score, and he did. At 5:15 p.m. Her Netherlands Majesty's ship Courtenaire exploded, jackknifed and sank. Takagi, seeing his chance with the Allied force in confusion, and slowed down to 15 knots by Exeter's mishap, ordered his entire force in for the kill. Dorman sent the 3 British destroyers to counter-attack through smoke to the northwestward, where Tanaka's squadron was milling about and trying pot shots. By this time, in the gathering dusk, the entire battle area was shrouded in smoke, through which only an occasional blinker signal from Admiral Dorman reached his ships. Electra, which received this latest order at 5:25 p.m., scored a hit on Jintsu, but in return was stopped dead by a shell exploding in a boiler room. Tanaka now drove in to try and finish off limping Exeter, but was frustrated by the nimble footwork of destroyers Jupiter, Witte de With and Encounter. The enemy then doubled back to gang up on Electra. She fulfilled the tragic implication of her name at 6 p.m. Dorman, in the meantime, had ordered Exeter, escorted by Witter de With, to Surabaya, and reformed his column in this order: De Ruyter, Perth, Houston, Java, with the 4 United States destroyers flank and rear. The cruisers now engaged in another long-range gunfire duel, in which Houston took 2 duds. As Dorman was steering south, Takagi assumed that he was retreating, advised the convoy, which had turned north, to resume course for the landing beaches, and sent Nishimura's squadron to finish off the Allies. Nishimura scored not one hit with the 24 torpedoes his squadron launched. Dorman now ordered the United States destroyers to cover his retirement. Their squadron commander, T.H. Binford, regarding attack as the best means to cover, turned north to torpedo Nachi and Haguro. Unfortunately, the American torpedoes had been set so that they could only be fired broadside, and under these circumstances to close to a proper range would mean almost certain destruction by the cruiser's gunfire before launching. Binford therefore took a chance shot at 10,000 yards, and all torpedoes missed. After a short gunfire duel with destroyer Asagumo, possibly holing her, the 4 Pipers hastened to catch up with Admiral Dorman. That great sea dog never acknowledged defeat. At 6:30 p.m. he had radioed to Admiral Helfrich ashore: "Enemy retreating west. Where's the convoy?" At that very moment Takagi ordered the convoy to reverse course and stand northward. It was then only 30 miles away. The Japanese did not underestimate the ability of Dorman, now steering northwesterly, to get at the convoy, and if the Allies had had any air reconnaissance, they might have evaded Takagi's ships and struck a fatal blow. But the dice were loaded against them. At about 1927, the converging cruisers sighted each other again in the gathering darkness. Nachi led Haguro, Jintsu, and several destroyers. 13,000 yards to the southeastward was De Ruyter, followed by Perth, Houston, Java, and 4 American destroyers. His Majesty's ship Jupiter was stationed about a mile on De Ruyter's port bow. Perth and Houston opened fire at 1933, but their shells fell short. The enemy fired star shells to illuminate, and at 1936, when Captain Waller, Ran of Perth, saw a row of flashes in the enemy column, he rightly suspected that they meant torpedo launchings and swung hard right to course 60°. The other ships followed suit, and this, the 4th Japanese torpedo attack, was successfully evaded. Dorman now planned to escape these troublesome ships and get at the convoy by following the coast of Java west. So, at 1955, he swung his column south and at flank speed steamed toward the Java coast, which soon loomed up in the moonlight. There could be no escape, since he was continually illuminated by Japanese float planes dropping flares. When his column reached Shoalwater, at 9 p.m., Admiral Dorman turned right to parallel the coast. The United States destroyers at this point left the formation and turned east for Surabaya. Dorman had instructed them to do that when their torpedoes were expended, as now they were. As Dorman's force continued westward along the coast, it skirted a newly laid Dutch minefield whose exact position had been broadcast at frequent intervals. At high speed the cruisers, followed by 2 destroyers, cleared the mined area safely, but at 9:25 p.m. an explosion racked His Majesty's ship Jupiter, and she dropped out, victim either of a floating mine that had broken loose or of an internal explosion. She sank 4 hours later. Shortly after Jupiter exploded, Admiral Dorman turned his 4 cruisers north again. Although he now had but 1 destroyer with him and no air support, this brave officer determined to make one last desperate thrust to thwart the invasion of Java. It was a self-terminatory move. Zigzagging slightly, the column steamed northward, hoping to avoid further attention from the enemy. Over an hour passed and nothing happened, except that destroyer encounter dropped out to pick up survivors from Courtenaire on life rafts. Then Nachi, Haguro, and several destroyers were sighted in bright moonlight on the port beam, steering south. Takagi reversed course to parallel Dorman, and the 2 columns exchanged long-range gunfire for 20 minutes, hoping for a lucky hit. Salvos came slowly now, since both sides were low on ammunition and their crews were near exhaustion. At 11:20 p.m., when the 2 columns were almost parallel, 8,000 yards apart, the Japanese cruisers launched 12 torpedoes. De Ruyter and Java, caught in the wide spread, burst into flames, exploded and stopped dead. Java lived for only 15 minutes. De Ruyter defiantly floated for about 3 hours. Their captains and Admiral Dorman followed the hard ritual of the sea and went down with them. Before he lost contact with Perth and Houston, Dorman had ordered them not to stand by him, but to retire to Batavia. They headed for Tanjong Priok, where they signalled to Admiral Helfrich the tragic results of the Battle of the Java Sea. In one afternoon and evening, half the ships of Admiral Dorman's striking force had been destroyed. The Japanese had not lost a single ship, and only one destroyer was damaged. The convoy was never touched. The main factors in this battle, any one of which would have doomed the Allies to defeat, were complete lack of air power, bad communications, and the enemy's superiority in torpedoes. The most surprising thing about the battle was its duration. Before World War II, most strategists thought that gun and torpedo fire had been developed to such a degree that naval battles would be decided in a few minutes, at the end of which one side would either be annihilated or so crippled that it could fight no more. Several battles in this war, notably Savo Island, were of that description. But in the Battle of the Java Sea, the two opponents slugged each other intermittently over a period of some 7 hours before one had to break off and admit defeat. That it lasted so long was due to Admiral Dorman's stubborn determination and the admirable manner in which men of the three navies under his command fought until they could fight no more. Java Sea was indeed a decisive battle. There was nothing now to stop the Japanese invasion. And when brave Dorman went down, his country's colonial empire was doomed. Even the eventual Allied victory could not eradicate the effects of this Japanese triumph. Never again would the Netherlanders rule over these beautiful islands and their volatile people. One Allied disaster after another followed the Java Sea battle. Seaplane tender Langley, pioneer carrier of the United States Navy, was sunk by airbombing south of Cilacap on 27 February while trying to bring in plane reinforcements. On the last night of February, USS Houston and His Majesty's Australian ship Perth, survivors of the Java Sea, gallantly charged into Banton Bay, adjoining Sunda Strait, to break up one of the major Japanese amphibious forces that was being landed. If only Dorman and his other ships had been with them, they could have realized the American-British-Dutch-Australia dream of breaking up a Japanese invasion force at its most vulnerable moment. But alas, it was so late, they were so few, and Admiral Kurita's Western Covering Group, built around 4 heavy cruisers, was too strong. Destroyer Fubuki almost caught Houston and Perth as they entered Banton Bay. She fired torpedoes at them at a range of about 2,700 yards, missed them, but hit and sank a couple of Japanese transports on their port hand. The cruisers swung around the bay, shooting up transports as they passed. One was sunk outright, and 3 others had to be beached. As they roared through the narrow channel between Panjang Island and St. Nicholas Point, the 2 cruisers ran into a fatal trap. On the port hand, a Japanese destroyer squadron blocked Sunda Strait, their escape hatch. On the starboard hand, freshly replenished, oversize heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma opened up on the 2 depleted, exhausted treaty cruisers. The Japanese shooting from almost point-blank range was inaccurate, but so overwhelming that only a miracle could have changed the result. His Majesty's Australian ship Perth came under fire at 11:26 p.m. At 12:05 a.m. March 1, she took a torpedo in her forward engine room that almost lifted her out of the water, then another, and in a few moments she went down, taking Captain Waller and hundreds more. Now every Japanese ship concentrated on putting Houston away. She was already listing dangerously to starboard. Around 12:10 a.m. she took a salvo in her after-engine room, which burst all the steam lines and scalded to death the entire engine room force. A torpedo hit forward smashed up main battery plot, whose crew was wiped out by a shell burst as they ran topside. Turrets went to local control, and for a few moments the gunners profited by a mistake that the enemy made. Illuminating his own ships, they hit 3 different destroyers and sank a minesweeper. A shell hit No. 2 turret just as powder bags were being loaded, starting a fire which forced Captain Rooks to have both magazines flooded. Now the 2 8-inch turrets had no ammunition except what was already in the hoists. 3 torpedoes hit the ship on her starboard side, and shrapnel from small-caliber fire ricocheted about her superstructure. Around 12:25 a.m., standing near a machine-gun mount, Rooks and the gun crew were killed by a bursting shell. Men stood by the other guns and fired every bit of ammunition until all was expended. Then, as the ship lost headway, Japanese destroyers swarmed about her, machine-gunning the quarterdeck and the port hangar where many of the survivors from below had congregated. Commander David Roberts, the executive, ordered abandon ship, and Seaman Stafford, standing on the careening fantail, sounded the call on his bugle at 12:33 a.m. Within 10 or 12 minutes, Houston rolled over and sank. Swimming survivors could see her ensign defiantly flying until it dipped below the waters of Sunda Strait. On this same bloody 1st of March, His Majesty's ship Exeter tried to lead USS destroyer Pope and His Majesty's ship Encounter through the Surabaya minefields to safety. All three were sunk by enemy naval gunfire and carrier bombing planes. Japanese troops swarmed over Java, and on the 9th the Dutch commanding general surrendered the Netherlands East Indies. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force was now free to raid the Indian Ocean, where Admiral Sir James Somerville, one of England's senior and most versatile flag officers, awaited him with the British Far Eastern Force, 5 old battleships, 3 small carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The Japanese had it pretty much their own way from 25 March to 8 April, striking Colombo and Trincomalee, sinking carrier Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers, and about 136,000 tons of merchant shipping. In 4 months' time, Nagumo had operated 1/3 of the way around the world. He had conducted strikes against ships and shore installations at Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, Ambon, Darwin, Java, and Ceylon. He had sunk 5 battleships, an aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and 7 destroyers, had damaged several more capital ships, disposed of some 200,000 tons of fleet auxiliaries and merchantmen, and hundreds of Allied aircraft. Yet not one ship of his striking force had been even damaged by enemy action. There was no longer any doubt as to what type would be the capital ship of the future. The Malay barrier was now shattered, except for isolated pockets of resistance, such as Corregidor, the colonial empires of the United States, the Netherlands and Great Britain, as far west as India and as far south as Australia, had joined that of the French, already liquidated. Within 4 months of the Pearl Harbor strike, Japan had achieved her greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. She was poised to lash backward into China, or, if America and Britain did not throw in the sponge, forward by the right flank into India and by the left flank into the Aleutians and Hawaii. Were our efforts, then, to defend the Malay barrier a waste of men and material? Admiral King is reported to have characterized the whole Southwest Pacific campaign as a magnificent display of very bad strategy. He never said what he thought good strategy would have been. Probably he meant abandoning Singapore and concentrating on defending Java, which might possibly have worked. Be that as it may, the Allies did well to fight for the Malay barrier, although fighting alone could not save it. Recent experience of the French showed the moral cost of too easy and complacent a capitulation. Another such in Southeast Asia might have been too much for the Allies to bear. So, while we mourn Houston and the other gallant ships of 3 navies that went down with most of their officers and men after fighting so bravely and well, we should not regard their efforts as vain. Their desperate exploits should forever be held in proud and affectionate remembrance by the American, British, Dutch, Australia nations, America, Britain, the Netherlands, and Australia. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was as much of a surprise to Hitler as to the United States. He had been trying to persuade Japan to attack Russia. The Chicago Tribune on 4 December printed a purloined document in which the ABC conference decision of March to beat Germany first was embodied, and the German charge at Washington promptly transmitted this to Berlin. But the revelation, instead of encouraging Hitler to continue his policy of avoiding war with the United States as long as possible, caused him to declare war on the United States, 11 December 1941. Mussolini obediently followed, and that afternoon Congress declared war on Germany and Italy. Admiral King, appointed Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet on 20 December 1941 at the age of 63, was relieved 10 days later as Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet by Admiral Royal E. Ingersoll. As the functions of the Chief of Naval Operations overlapped those of a shore-based Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet, President Roosevelt gave King the Chief of Naval Operations job too, on 12 March 1942. King was a man of adamant, as Mahan described Sir John Jervis. Tall, spare and taut, with piercing brown eyes, a powerful Roman nose and deeply cleft chin, he looked the part and filled the part of Commander-in-Chief of the fleet. King was a sailor's sailor. He believed that what was good for the Navy was good for the United States, and indeed the world. In that sense, and that alone, he was narrow. But he had a firm grasp of naval strategy and tactics, an encyclopedic knowledge of naval detail, an immense capacity for work and complete integrity. Endowed with a superior intellect himself, he had no toleration for fools or weaklings. He hated publicity, did not lend himself to popular build-up, and was the despair of interviewers. Unlike Admiral Stark's decisions, King's were made quickly and without much consultation. When anyone tried to argue with him beyond a certain point, a characteristic bleak look came over his countenance as a signal that his mind was made up and further discussion was useless. Although he had nothing of the courtier in his makeup, King acquired and retained the confidence and esteem of President Roosevelt. The two men were in a sense complementary. Each had what the other lacked, and in concert with General Marshall, who shared the qualities of both, they formed a perfect winning team. The Republic has never had more efficient, intelligent and upright servants than these three men. Admiral King made Rear Admiral Russell Wilson his Chief of Staff, and brought with him to Washington from the Atlantic Fleet Rear Admiral Richard S. Edwards as Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Francis S. Lowe as Operations Officer, and Commander George L. Russell as Flag Secretary. As Assistant Chiefs of Staff, he appointed Rear Admirals Richmond K. Turner and Willis Augustus Lee. When Turner went to Guadalcanal, he was relieved as Assistant Chief of Staff for plans by Rear Admiral Charles Massavy Cook. Apart from Edwards, Wilson, Russell and Cook, and Vice Admiral Frederick J. Horn, who became Vice Chief of Naval Operations in March 1942, Admiral King kept a continual turnover on his staff. Senior officers were constantly being brought in from different theatres of war, retained on duty with Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet Chief of Naval Operations for a few months, then sent back to sea. Thus, the fighting Navy point of view was maintained at Washington. Since escort of convoy was every day becoming more important and required heavy communications facilities, Admiral King took the direction of it with him from Newport to Washington. Shortly after becoming Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet, he exchanged views on the subject with the Admiralty. This resulted in transatlantic convoy routes being shifted southward, and the Canadian Navy being given a greater share in escorting slow convoys to a mid-ocean meeting point at Long. 22° west, about 500 miles from Northern Ireland, where Royal Navy escorts could take over, and the Canadians proceed to Londonderry to fuel. The fast Halifax UK convoys were escorted by United States destroyers to mid-ocean meeting point, where they too were relieved by the Royal Navy, refuelled at Londonderry, and escorted a fast convoy home. This change of the turnaround point from Iceland to Ireland was most welcome to bluejackets. Londonderry, a dour Presbyterian city, seemed like Coney Island after Reykjavik, and the green Irish countryside looked like heaven after the barren wastes of Iceland. Repair facilities also were superior, since Londonderry was already an important base of the Royal Navy, and the main British centre for anti-submarine training. The British Dome Teacher, in which sailors were trained to the use of anti-aircraft guns in a sort of planetarium, was of immense value to American gunners, as were the British Thames submarines on which escort vessels practised both day and night attacks. Admiral Ingersoll, as Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, exercised complete responsibility for troop convoys, the first of which sailed from Halifax 10 January 1942 and arrived Londonderry about 2 weeks later. It was desirable to build up United States Army forces in the United Kingdom immediately, so that there would be no shortage of troop lift as in 1918 when the Army was ready to strike. And a heavy American escort, including battleships and cruisers as well as destroyers. These convoys also enjoyed all the blimp and airplane escort that was available at each end of the route. Heavy weather was often encountered, and an occasional sound contact on a submarine was made, but a speed of 12.5 to 14.5 knots was maintained, and not a ship or a soldier was lost. Fueling at sea was another problem. The old short-legged 1,200-ton destroyers had been designed in the light of World War I experience, when all that was expected of an escort was a 48-hour run outbound or inbound. But the necessities of escort duty in 1941 to 1942 were such that every United States destroyer had to cover the route Argentia mid-ocean meeting point Iceland, or the reverse, which required at least 10 days steaming. It was impossible for such ships in winter weather to conduct the active, aggressive patrolling enjoined on all by the fate of USS Kearney and Reuben James. Before the war, fueling at sea had been practiced largely in calm weather, and only from battleships. Now it had to be done from merchant tankers. On one transatlantic convoy, 4 tankers, rigged for ocean fueling abreast or astern, made 20 fuelings of escorts, 4 or 5 times on some of them. The scarcity of suitable escorts was the greatest handicap during this period. Coast Guard Cutter Campbell, employed as escort in November 1941, proved so effective that most of her sister ships of the Treasury class were diverted to this duty. These big seagoing cutters had everything that a destroyer had except speed and torpedoes, and seldom does an opportunity arise to use torpedoes in escort of convoy. United States Coast Guard cutter Alexander Hamilton was torpedoed and sunk 10 miles off Iceland, 29 January 1942, when towing a disabled storeship. Air cover at this period could only be provided at each end of the transatlantic route, and from Iceland. In anti-submarine warfare, air search proved so valuable for locating and destroying U-boats that every effort was made to extend and enlarge the coverage. By the end of 1942, a squadron of 4-engine Liberators operating out of Greenland proved a great help in mid-ocean, but even they left a big dark pocket around the Azores, where U-boats operated with impunity and even refueled from special submarine milch cows sent out for that purpose. The Navy was eager to light up this pocket by occupying the Azores and installing airfields there, but Dr. Salazar, Premier of Portugal, would not allow this until late 1943, when he had decided that the Allies were going to win, and the Allies could not violate their own principles by seizing part of a neutral country. A convoy is beautiful, whether seen from a deck or from the sky. The inner core of stolid ships in several columns is never equally spaced, for each has her individuality. One is always straggling or ranging ahead until the Commodore becomes vexed and signals angrily, "Number so-and-so, take station and keep station around the merchant ships is thrown the screen like a loose-jointed necklace, the beads lunging to port or starboard, and then snapping back as though pulled by a mighty submarine elastic. Each destroyer nervous and questing, all eyes topside looking for the enemy, sound gear below listening for him, radar antennae like cat's whiskers feeling for him. On dark nights, only a few shapes of ships a little darker that the black water can be discerned. One consults the radar screen to ascertain that the flock is all there. To one coming topside for the dawn watch, it is a recurring wonder to see the same ships day after day, each in her appointed station, each with her characteristic top hamper, bow wave, lift and dip. The inevitable straggler, the inveterate smoker, the vessel with an old shellback master who knew more about shipping 40 years ago than any goddamn gold braid in a tin can, and whose sullen fury at being convoyed translates itself into belated turns, unanswered signals and insolent comebacks. When air cover is furnished, there are darting, swooping planes about the convoy. Upon approaching port, the stately silver bubble of a blimp comes out, swaying in the breeze and blinking a cheery welcome. There is nothing beautiful, however, about a night attack on a convoy, unless you see it from a submarine's periscope. A torpedo hit is signalled by a flash and a great orange flare, followed by a muffled roar. Guns crack at imaginary targets, star shell breaks out, a rescue ship hurries to the scene of the sinking, and sailors in other ships experience a helpless fury and dread. If the convoy has a weak escort, it can only execute an emergency turn and trust that the rest of the wolf pack will be thrown off or driven down. If the escort is sufficient, a killer group peels off, searching relentlessly with radar and sonar, while everyone stands by hoping to feel underfoot the push of distant depth charges that tells of a fight with a submerged enemy. The only American-escorted convoy that lost heavily during the first 4 months of 1942 was on 67 of 35 ships in 8 columns, which crossed westward during the full moon of February. The ocean escort, consisting of the United States destroyers Edison, Nicholson, Lear and Bernadou, under Commander A.C. Murdaugh, steamed south to join from Iceland. Shortly after they took over, at 1:05 p.m. February 22, 2 ships were torpedoed and sunk. In the early hours of 24 February, 4 more were torpedoed and 2 sank. All day the screen made wide sweeps and aggressive patrols, which continued throughout the night. 2 U-boats were sighted in the moonlight and depth-charged, but both escaped. Commander Murdaugh's officers were alert and zealous, but deficient in attack technique. Escort units, composed usually of 2 United States destroyers and 4 Canadian corvettes, directed by such seasoned commanders as W.K. Phillips in Mayo, P.R. Heineman in Benson, H.C. Fitz in Niblack, John B. Heffernan in Gleaves and R.W. Hungerford in Bristol, were getting the ships across safely, but they were not sinking any U-boats. When March came in like a lion, weather became more deadly than the submarine. A convoy cannot heave to like a single steamship, because vessels act so differently hove to that collisions and wide scattering would result. It has to keep going somewhere, somehow. Except for 2 ships sunk out of convoy on 68, the casualties in March were caused by the weather. A prompt attack by U-boats on American coastal shipping should have been anticipated, since they had done just that during World War I. No U-boats happened to be in position to raid American coasts when Germany declared war on the United States in December 1941, but Admiral Dönitz chose 5 of his best aces, and followed them by 6 more to devastate the American East Coast shipping lanes. These originate in the St. Lawrence River, cross the Gulf of Maine, past New York, where at least 50 ships arrived and departed daily, and extend past the Capes of Delaware, the Chesapeake and Hatteras, into the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and down past the Bulge of Brazil. Operation Paukenschlag, Roll of the Drums, as the Germans called it, opened on 12 January 1942, when a British steamer was torpedoed and sunk about 300 miles east of Cape Cod by U-123. 2 days later, enemy submarines moved into the shipping bottleneck off Cape Hatteras. 3 tankers in succession were sunk on 14 and 15 January. Next day, the U-boats sank a Canadian lady boat and 2 freighters, then 3 tankers in succession and 3 more before the end of the month, 13 vessels in all, measuring 95,000 gross tons, and 70% of this tanker tonnage were lost in a little over 2 weeks. No more perfect setup for rapid and ruthless destruction could have been offered the German authoritarian sea lords. The massacre enjoyed by the U-boats along our Atlantic coast in 1942 was as much a national disaster as if saboteurs had destroyed 6 of our biggest war plants. The damage in the eastern sea frontier was wrought by no more than 12 U-boats operating at any one time, and every month the Germans were building 20 or more new 740 and 500 tonners. Each U-boat carried 14 torpedoes, including some of the new electrically propelled type that showed no air bubbles in the wake, so could not be sighted or dodged. In addition, they carried guns of sufficient caliber to sink most merchant vessels by shellfire alone. The 500 tonners carried enough fuel for a cruise of at least 42 days, allowing 2 weeks for the outward passage and the same for homeward to a French port. They could spend 2 weeks in the Atlantic coastal lanes. Their usual tactics in the early months of 1942 were to approach a trade route at periscope depth, lie in wait on the surface at night, and launch torpedoes from seaward against a vessel whose silhouette might be seen against shorelights. One of the most reprehensible failures on our part was the neglect of local communities to dim their waterfront lights, or of military authorities to require them to do so, until 3 months after the submarine offensive started. When this obvious defense measure was first proposed, squawks went all the way from Atlantic City to southern Florida that the tourist season would be ruined. Miami and its luxurious suburbs threw up 6 miles of neon light glow, against which was silhouetted southbound shipping that hugged the shore to avoid the Gulf Stream. Ships were sunk and seamen drowned in order that the citizenry might enjoy pleasure as usual.